Alrighty everyone, welcome back to the channel. We are replacing lower ball joints today on the '07 Honda Civic. A pretty easy one to replace because it bolts to the control arm and bolts to the knuckle. So I'm going to show you how to do it. So we're replacing the ball joints today because I got a kit and they're part of the kit. I have a squeak that I believe is coming from the outer tie rod, which normally it is the lower ball joint that squeaks. So if you have a front end squeak, most cases a lower ball joint or bushings on a lower control arm or something like that. But this one, it was actually louder from the outer tie rod. So it's either one, the outer tie rod squeaking, or two, they're both squeaking and the outer tie rod's louder. Either way, it's a big kit for a bunch of them, so I'm doing multiple videos on each part I'm replacing, and this is how you do the lower ball joint. Alright, so before we get into it, if you are replacing this lower ball joint, it's going to be a lot easier if you take off the tie rod. Just unattach it here from the steering knuckle, and that will allow you to move this back and forth and give yourself a lot more room. So let's get going. So before you take the old ball joint out and start taking the car apart, just bring it over here. Try and eyeball the old one as best you can. Make sure it looks the same. You know, for instance, this one's got the ball joint, two studs, and a bolt hole. This one has the same thing. So we are good to go, ready to get started. So the first step in removing the outer tie rod is you're going to want to get this cotter pin off. Cotter pin right there is a pin that you shove through and then bend the edges. That cotter pin prevents the nut from coming all the way off. If it were to get loose for some reason, it would stop at the cotter pin for at least a small amount of time and sound like complete garbage and sound very scary before it completely comes off and you lose steering. So it's important to put one back in. Most kits should come with a brand new one. Mine did. Replace that every time you take them off. Normally, anytime there is a cotter pin like that, you're going to have a castle nut like this. This has a castle nut, that has a castle nut. And what you're supposed to do is get that lined up so that the castle nut is kind of held in place by the cotter pin through that hole. I'll show you when I put the new ones on. Alright, as you can see, we have our outer tie rod disconnected, which allows us all kinds of movement, which will be good for tightening and loosening all these bolts. So we're going to start with these three on the bottom. Go ahead and undo these three fasteners. I would start with the bolt up here and then do the two nuts. Don't forget that before you do this next step, you have to subscribe to the channel. Please. It is a 17 millimeter. This will obviously work with hand tools, breaker bar, or just a 1/2 inch drive ratchet should work totally fine. So normally you would be wanting to break loose this top nut first on this ball joint, but because these studs go all the way through the control arm, I'll still be able to break that loose no problem without this moving at all. Because it's actually quite a bit of effort to lift that out of the control arm. So it's got the studs. I still have plenty to get that loose. Next step after taking these off, get the cotter pin out of this ball joint nut, and then we'll get that nut off. And as long as you have somewhat proficient tools, you do not need to remove the axle on this job. Oh, I totally forgot. This little cotter pin is actually super weird. Let me see if I can find the one from the other side to show you how it goes. Alright, so this is the factory style cotter pin. You can see that it goes through the middle and then the other half it loops around and actually hooks on the castle nut. So a little more detailed than a regular cotter pin, but nonetheless you got to get it off. Although this one is a little bit different than a regular one. So this one I recommend doing is getting something like a pocket screwdriver like this, a really small screwdriver, jeweler's screwdriver, small pick, something skinny. Get it right in there. What you have to do is pop that out, and you can kind of see when I shove that in, it pops this out of the castle nut. Now there's a gap. It's hooked in there. When we do this, it pops it out. And then after you do that, you'll have to pull on here. You can do that with your fingers or pliers or another small screwdriver, stick it in there and pop it out. Doing this second one just now, I actually figured out an even easier way. Is this cotter pin was on the side like this. And I actually just went from the bottom, got my screwdriver in the hole I was telling you about on the very end, and then just flipped it all the way up straight. And now it should pull right out. So that's the other option, is get in this hook, like I said, and then just tilt it totally vertical, pull right out. Next step is to break this nut loose and see if we can get the ball joint out. So I just broke this loose. It's a 19 millimeter. The 19's a little loose, but the 18 doesn't fit at all. So, and it's a Japanese car, so I would go with the 19. If you want to try an American wrench, if you got them, go right ahead, be my guest. I'm going to leave the nut right about here and try to get this ball joint out. So the first step is to get this part of the ball joint out of the lower control arm. So what I'm going to do is get a long pry bar and pry down on this control arm and try and pry this piece up and out. And you know what? Just to make it easier, I'm going to bust off this nut right here for the sway bar end link. I'm going to take that off so that the sway bar isn't resisting me pushing the control arm down. That's how it's done. Always be careful when you're prying that you don't pry against anything that could break. For instance, I shoved my pry bar all the way through and into the frame. I didn't pry on the steering rack or tie rods or anything like that, or the axle or anything. Pry on frame pieces if you can, subframe, control arms, that kind of thing. Alrighty. So just to show you, I had my long pry bar, it's a pretty big one, through here, all the way through there. What I did was I went past the tie rod, and I just stuck it into the frame crease back there. Right. And then I got a second one and just popped it in here and pushed down on the control arm with the big one and pushed up on the ball joint with the smaller pry bar. Now, the hardest part of this job is the next step, which is getting this ball joint out. It's likely pretty stuck in there, and there are two different tools you can use to get this out. Either one should make it pretty easy, and I have one of them, and it seems to work. So I'm actually going to turn this back this way, and I'll show you my tool. So this is a pickle fork. So this is a pickle fork. I just picked this set up off of Amazon because I hammered on that ball joint and I could not get it out. So I picked up this set. The reason I got this set is because it comes with this end, and this end. That's 3 different ends. They're different sizes. This one's wider, that one's narrower, thicker, right? They're all different. And the easy part about this is, so I just took this one back off to show you. This one, this one, this one, they all thread on. And you can either thread them onto this big handle that you can use to hammer on, pry on and everything, nice and thick, or you can put them on this handle, and the point in this handle is it has an air hammer attachment. That's what this end is for. So that's pretty cool because sometimes you need the air hammer to reciprocate this back and forth and hammer some stuff out. Pretty cool. This one has the 3 ends and they go on either the air hammer adapter or just the regular pound on it adapter. So, and they got a little jam nut to get it tight. So I'm going to screw this back onto here and we'll hammer away. The other tool you can get is an actual ball joint separator. These are called pickle forks, and there's a ball joint separator which Does the same thing, but in a totally different way. And I actually did order a set of those, but they didn't come yet, so I tried this, and this works totally fine for this job. But if you already have or want a ball joint separator or something, that will work too. And I'll throw up a picture of what those look like right here.
So fancy.
Alrighty, so now that you know you can use either a pickle fork or a ball joint separator, let me show you how the pickle fork operates. It's going to be nice and dark in here, but the gist of it is this ball joint is stuck up in this metal piece. So what we need to do is go between this metal part of the knuckle and the metal part of the ball joint. You shove the pickle fork in there, and what the pickle fork does is it gradually gets thicker and thicker, which means the further you push it in, the bigger it makes the gap between these two, and it eventually pops out. Pickle fork. I'm not really sure if it matters which way you do this, although obviously the angled side is where it's going to push, so I just put the flat side up against the knuckle because you don't want it to move. So that is about where you want it. Yes, it's going to squish all of the freaking grease out of that joint, which is why you don't do this unless you're replacing the ball joint. But this boot's already ripped and all that jazz. So as you can see, like I said, it is up against the knuckle and between the ball joint. You want it touching the knuckle, and then in theory it's going to touch the boot if you still have boot left. So that's where you want it. I'm going to push it in as far as I can. And now, unless it comes out by hand, it isn't, so I'm going to leave it there and I'm going to smack it with a hammer. She's in there, but she can go further. Hello. So once the ball joint actually breaks loose, it will usually make a popping sound, a loud noise, or your tool will just get loose using this. Using an actual separator, it'll probably pop. It'll just be like, bunk, and then your tool will fall. Using this, because I still have the nut on there, nothing fell out. It just got in there, and then once it came out, my tool got all loose and wobbly. If I would have not left the nut on, it would have fallen out, but I left the nut on just to hold it all. Let me show you. So you can see it is now sitting on the nut, and the tool is nice and loose. So let me pull this out. You can see, nice and loose. So I left the nut on there to catch it. But now we'll take the nut off, and it will fall out. Woo! And that, ladies and farts, is how you take the lower ball joint off the 2007 Honda Civic. Or if you have another vehicle that is a similar design to this. That's a greasy motherfucker. Who's here? Alright, now to put the new one in reverse order. Also remember, whenever you're taking any of these off, you should subscribe to my YouTube channel. As I've said in other videos, remember to check your parts. So what we want to do is bonsai view these, make sure they look good. They look the same. We got a ball joint, we got two studs, roughly the same length, and we got a threaded hole. That's good. It goes on double check stuff. Even if you do get the right parts, maybe it comes and this hole's not threaded or something weird. That happens. Looking good. Don't forget to put the Zerk fitting in on your new one if it has it. Otherwise, your grease will slowly get pushed out of that hole. And I'll do that right now before I put this in the car. I'll throw the Zerk fitting on, take this nut off, and then we'll throw this ball joint in the car. But they do look the same. And as I said before with ball joints, don't worry about this being off to a little bit of an angle. It's a ball joint. It has the ability to move. So other than the angle the ball joint's sitting at, make sure they're identical. Now Zerk fitting, bro. Shit. Alright, here it is. And this new one came with new nuts and new cotter pin for these studs and the ball joint nut. But for now, we're going to put this bad boy in. I hear my woman pulling into the driveway. Will she be mad at me for being in the garage? No, because I have dinner in the oven. That's how you do it, boys. Get that food ready. Alright, it's a 9. Tighten that down, snug it up. Not super tight. This isn't super strong. Just snug. Alright, we got our part. It's all ready to go. Zerk fitting tight. New nuts and new cotter pin and new castle nut ready to rock. Let's throw this bad boy in the car. So we're going to go in reverse order, meaning castle nut, ball joint, stud first. Alright, so I have that nut threaded on just a teeny tiny bit to kind of hold that bad boy in place. So now what we're going to do is try and lift it back into the control arm, and I might have to use double pry bars again. Not too bad. A couple things you want to be aware of is make sure when you're trying to get this back in, it might pop in once it lines up, so make sure your fingers are nowhere in between the control arm and ball joint or they will get pinched. I use the same pry bar method to go back in. Big pry bar on the control arm, small pry bar navigating the ball joint into place. One more thing that you want to be really conscious of and careful of anytime you have the knuckle kind of floating around. By floating around, I mean lower ball joint out, tie rod off, stuff like that, is if you pull this too far, your axles, if you have CV axles, can pop out, especially the joint back here or the CV joint here, can kind of pop out of place. So basically just be careful you don't pull it too far out. You saw I just pulled a little bit and it's totally fine, but if you pull too far, they will kind of pop out and you'll know because you won't be able to get this far enough back. So just be aware of that, but you'll probably be totally fine as long as you don't try and pull this all the way freaking a foot out or something. And if you, for some reason, think you need to pull this out that far, just take the axle nut off. So the next step will be to snug some of these bolts up on the ball joint. I am going to try and get that bolt started and then probably snug these nuts down. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to do the opposite because using the two nuts on these bad boys will actually line that up, I think, because we got a little bit of a gap here. You can see that gap? So if I put the two nuts on these studs, it should pull everything together, and I will do that to pull everything together, and then I will back them off about one turn to give me looseness to get that bolt started. So as I was saying, once those snugged up, everything straightened out, kind of lined up, which is what I was talking about earlier. So now I'm just going to back this off a little bit. Now I will attempt to get the bolt in. And now all three are snug. This is snug. So I will snug up this castle nut with my fingers. And now we're on to torquing stuff. Don't forget that when you're torquing these to spec, you want to subscribe to the channel. At this point, we can now shove this back through. We are good to go. And don't forget to tighten your wheel and tire down, stuff like that, you know. Tighten everything, do all the stuff, like, subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. Puss.